5 years after the fall of the Galactic Empire, Marcus Chen stood at the podium of the Intergalactic Academy's graduation ceremony. At 19, he had become the youngest being ever to complete the Academy's advanced diplomatic program. But more importantly, he represented something that would have been impossible under the old imperial system. A human speaking as an equal to representatives from across the galaxy. The Academy itself was a symbol of how much had changed. Built on the ruins of the former Imperial War College, it now trained diplomats, engineers, scientists, and leaders from every species in the cooperative. The rigid hierarchies that had once determined who could learn what had been replaced by merit-based selection that ignored species entirely. "Honored graduates," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the massive auditorium. 5 years ago, my mother watched the galaxy transform because someone decided that no being should have to accept being treated as inferior. Today we gather as equals not because we're the same, but because we've learned to value our differences. In the audience, Ambassador Sarah Chen smiled with obvious pride. Her son had grown into a confident young man who understood both the price of freedom and the responsibility that came with it. Beside her sat Admiral Morrison, now retired from military service and serving as the Academy's Director of Strategic Studies. "The old empire lasted 1,000 years, Marcus continued, because it convinced people that might made right. The Galactic Cooperative has lasted 5 years because we've learned that cooperation makes everyone stronger." He gestured to the diverse audience of graduates representing 47 different species. "Each of you carries knowledge, perspectives, and capabilities that no single species could develop alone. The Helix engineers who designed our quantum communication networks, the crystalline biologists who revolutionized medical treatment, the Keth-Moran physicists who made faster-than-light travel safe for everyone, the human military tacticians who taught us that the best victory is one where your enemy chooses to become your ally." In the front row, former Supreme Commander Zethkar listened with an expression that might have been approval. The old Dominar had spent 2 years in exile before requesting permission to return to galactic society. After intensive rehabilitation and community service, he now taught imperial history at the Academy, helping students understand how civilizations could fall when they lost sight of basic decency. "I want to tell you about a moment that changed everything," Marcus said, touching the small scar on his cheek that had never completely faded. 5 years ago, an imperial official struck me because he believed his species gave him the right to hurt anyone he considered inferior. That single act of casual cruelty sparked a revolution that freed billions of beings. He paused, looking directly at Zethkar. But the real victory wasn't defeating the Empire in battle. The real victory was proving that former enemies could become partners in building something better. The old Dominar inclined his head slightly, a gesture that still carried the dignity of his species, but now expressed respect rather than dominance. "Today, you graduate into a galaxy where your worth isn't determined by your species, your homeworld, or your family connections. It's determined by what you choose to do with your talents and opportunities. Some of you will become explorers, pushing the boundaries of known space. Others will become researchers, unlocking the secrets of the universe. Still others will become leaders, guiding the cooperative toward an even better future." Marcus activated the ceremonial display behind him, showing a map of current cooperative territory. It now encompassed 80% of the former empire, with new worlds requesting membership regularly. But we're not done yet. There are still worlds out there where beings suffer under oppression. There are still species that haven't heard the message that cooperation is stronger than conquest. There are still children who go to bed afraid that someone stronger might hurt them simply because they can. He looked out at the young faces in the audience, seeing the determination that would drive the next generation of galactic civilization. "Your generation has a mission that my mother's generation could only dream of. To spread the principles of the cooperative to every corner of the galaxy, not through conquest or coercion but through example and invitation. To show every species that there's a better way to live than in fear of those who claim to be superior." As he spoke, Marcus remembered a conversation he'd had with his mother the previous week. They had been discussing the challenges facing the cooperative as it continued to grow and evolve. "Do you ever worry that we'll make the same mistakes the Empire made?" he had asked. "That success will make us arrogant and we'll start treating other species the way they treated us?" Sarah had considered the question carefully. "Every day," she had admitted. That's why we built checks and balances into every level of the cooperative structure. That's why we rotate leadership positions. That's why we maintain the memorial to Imperial victims, to remind ourselves what happens when power isn't held accountable. Now, looking out at the diverse gathering of graduates, Marcus understood what she meant. The cooperative strength didn't come from military might or technological superiority. It came from the constant awareness that freedom was fragile and had to be protected through eternal vigilance. In closing, Marcus said, "I want you to remember that you are the children of revolution. Your parents and grandparents fought to create a galaxy where talent matters more than species, where cooperation defeats conquest, and where no child has to fear being hurt simply for existing." He smiled, thinking of all the young beings across the galaxy who would grow up never knowing the fear that had once defined interspecies relations. Now go out there and make sure their sacrifices weren't in vain. Build a galaxy worthy of their dreams. And remember that every being you meet, no matter how different they might seem, shares the same fundamental desire to live with dignity, to protect their loved ones, and to contribute something meaningful to the universe. The auditorium erupted in applause that came from dozens of different species, each expressing approval in their own way. The sound filled the chamber like a symphony of cooperation, each voice distinct but harmonious. As the ceremony concluded and graduates began their journeys to assignments across the galaxy, Marcus looked up at the stars visible through the Academy's transparent dome. Somewhere out there, new species were developing their first starships. New civilizations were taking their first steps into galactic society. New children were growing up in a universe where being different was celebrated rather than punished. The Age of Empires was over. The Age of Cooperation had begun, and it had all started because one young human boy had been struck by someone who thought he was too important to show basic decency to a child. Sometimes, Marcus reflected, the smallest acts of cruelty could spark the greatest revolutions, but more importantly, the smallest acts of kindness could ensure those revolutions created something worth having. 1 year after the Battle of Earth, Ambassador Sarah Chen stood in the newly constructed assembly hall on the neutral world of Haven Station. The massive chamber bustled with representatives from over 300 species, many of whom had never participated in galactic governance before the fall of the Empire. The Galactic Cooperative, as the new alliance had come to be known, was nothing like the rigid hierarchy that had preceded it. Instead of the Empire's top-down command structure, decisions were made through consensus among equals. It was messy, sometimes inefficient, but it represented something the galaxy hadn't seen in 1,000 years. Genuine cooperation between species. Marcus Chen, now 14 and serving as a junior aide to his mother's diplomatic team, watched from the observer's gallery as the final vote was tallied. The resolution before the assembly would establish the principles that would guide the cooperative's relationship with the remnants of the old empire. "The vote is unanimous," announced Speaker Talara, the former resistance leader who had been elected to preside over the assembly. "The Galactic Cooperative hereby offers full membership to any Dominar, world that renounces the old imperial system and accepts the principles of species equality." A murmur of conversation filled the chamber as representatives discussed the implications. In the years since the Empire's collapse, approximately 60% of Dominar worlds had already joined the cooperative. Another 30% remained nominally independent, but maintained friendly relations. Only a handful of die-hard Imperial loyalists continued to resist the new order. Sarah Chen activated her communicator as the session moved into recess. "Admiral Morrison, we've got the authorization you requested. The Assembly has approved the final phase of Operation Homecoming." Morrison's voice carried satisfaction, even through the encrypted channel. "Excellent, Ambassador. We'll begin the liberation of the remaining slave worlds immediately. It's time to finish what we started." In the months following the Empire's defeat, the most challenging task had been dismantling the vast network of slavery and forced labor that had sustained Imperial civilization. Billions of beings across hundreds of worlds needed to be freed, relocated if necessary, and helped to rebuild their societies. The humans had taken the lead in this effort, partly because their experience as a recently subjugated species gave them credibility with newly liberated populations, but mostly because they approached the problem with characteristic determination. "Mom," Marcus said as they walked through Haven Station's corridors after the session, Do you think the Dominar will ever really accept that things have changed? Sarah considered the question carefully. Some will, some won't. The younger generation seems more adaptable. It's the old imperial leadership that's having trouble accepting reality. They passed a group of Dominar refugees who had fled from hardline imperial worlds. These individuals had chosen exile rather than live under the new system of equality. Some worked as laborers or technicians, struggling to adapt to life without the privileges their species had once enjoyed. The ironic thing, Sarah continued, is that most ordinary Dominar are actually better off under the cooperative than they were under the Empire. The imperial system concentrated wealth and power among a tiny elite, while the majority lived in relative poverty. Marcus nodded, remembering his history lessons about pre-war imperial society, like those mining worlds where Dominar workers were barely better off than the slaves they supervised. Exactly. The Empire's rigid hierarchy limited opportunities for everyone except those at the very top. Now talent and hard work matter more than species or birth circumstances. They arrived at the diplomatic quarter, where Sarah maintained her office as Earth's representative to the Cooperative Council. The workspace was modest compared to the opulent chambers that Imperial ambassadors had once enjoyed, but it was functional and efficient. Ambassador Chen, her aide Lieutenant Torres announced as they entered, "We've received the final casualty reports from the liberation campaigns." Sarah accepted the data tablet with mixed emotions. The year-long effort to free the Empire's slave worlds had been largely successful, but not without cost. Some Imperial holdouts had chosen to destroy their populations rather than see them freed. Rescue operations had saved millions, but not everyone. Total casualties? She asked. Approximately 200,000 beings killed or missing, Torres replied, but over 4 billion successfully liberated. The medical teams report that most of the freed populations are responding well to rehabilitation programs. Marcus looked up from his study materials. That's actually much better than the projections, isn't it? Yes, Sarah nodded. The resistance networks did excellent work identifying which worlds needed immediate intervention and which could wait for diplomatic solutions. A soft chime indicated an incoming priority transmission. Sarah activated the secure communication system, and Admiral Morrison's face appeared on the display. Ambassador, I wanted to give you a personal update on the situation in the former Imperial Core worlds, Morrison began. Supreme Commander Zethkar has finally agreed to negotiate. Sarah raised an eyebrow. After a year of refusing all contact? What changed his mind? Reality, Morrison replied bluntly. The last Imperial strongholds are running out of resources. Their forced labor population has been liberated. Their automated systems are still compromised by our sabotage programs, and their trade routes have been shut down by cooperative blockades. The Admiral gestured to something off-screen. More importantly, we're receiving defection requests from Imperial military units on a daily basis. Zethkar's own fleet commanders are abandoning him. He's finally realized that he has two choices: negotiate or watch his remaining territory collapse completely. What are his terms? Sarah asked, surprisingly reasonable. He's willing to accept personal exile in exchange for amnesty for Imperial military personnel who committed war crimes under orders. He also wants guarantees that Dominar civilians won't face reprisals. Marcus looked up with interest. Are we going to agree to that? Morrison nodded. The Cooperative Council voted to accept with conditions. Zethkar will be exiled to a remote world with a small security detail. War criminals will face trial, but rank-and-file Imperial personnel will be offered integration into cooperative society, and Dominar civilians already have full protection under our charter. When do negotiations begin? Sarah asked. Tomorrow, actually. The old Emperor has requested that you lead the cooperative delegation. Apparently, he was impressed by your handling of the initial diplomatic crisis. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction. The journey from watching her son get struck by an Imperial official to negotiating the formal end of that same empire had been longer and more difficult than she could have imagined. I'd be honored to represent the cooperative, she said. It seems fitting that this should end where it began, with a conversation about how we treat each other. As the transmission ended, Marcus looked up at his mother with obvious pride. Do you think this will really be the end? No more Imperial holdouts, no more resistance fighting? Sarah considered the question while gazing out at the stars visible through the station's massive viewing ports. Ships from dozens of species moved peacefully through the system, carrying trade goods, diplomatic messages, and refugees seeking new homes. I think we're going to find out what the galaxy looks like when species work together instead of fighting for dominance, she said finally. That might be the most important change of all. Their own fleets. Even the mighty planet killers were experiencing mysterious malfunctions that rendered them powerless. The time is right, Morrison announced. Today, the age of imperial dominance ends. You can choose to adapt to a galaxy where strength comes from cooperation rather than oppression, or you can cling to your old ways and watch your empire collapse around you. The transmission ended, leaving the Imperial Senate in stunned silence. Outside the chamber, emergency sirens wailed as reports of system failures and resistance victories continued to pour in. For 1,000 years, the Galactic Empire had ruled through fear and technological superiority. In a single day, both foundations had been shattered by species they had dismissed as primitives and slaves. Supreme Commander Zethkar looked around the chamber at his fellow Dominar, seeing his own fear reflected in their eyes. The empire that had seemed eternal and unshakable was collapsing, and they had no idea how to stop it. The Imperial retreat from Earth sent shockwaves throughout the galaxy that reached every corner of the Empire within days. High Dominar Zethkar stood in the emergency session of the Imperial Senate, his scaled face twisted with rage as he watched the holographic recordings of the battle. Impossible, he hissed for the 20th time, his claws scraping against the obsidian podium. 800 ships destroyed or captured by primitive rebels. How did our intelligence networks fail so completely? Grand Admiral Vexnari, one of the few surviving senior commanders from the Sol system debacle, stood before the assembled Dominar elite. His usual arrogance had been replaced by something the Empire hadn't seen in its leadership for centuries: genuine fear. Supreme Commander, the humans didn't just defeat us militarily. They demonstrated technologies we didn't know existed. Their quantum-linked battle networks allowed their entire fleet to fight as a single entity. Our pilots reported facing impossible reaction times and coordination. Senator Krextel, the Dominar representative for the Outer Rim territories, leaned forward in his ornate chair. What of the other species? Surely they were merely following human leadership? No, Supreme Commander. Each species brought unique capabilities that our scientists are still trying to understand. The Crystalline Collective's bioships regenerated damage faster than we could inflict it. The Kethamorn demonstrated weapons that bypassed our shields entirely. Zethkar's tail lashed violently, a sign of extreme agitation. These species have been under our control for centuries. When did they develop such capabilities? We believe they've been collaborating for decades, sharing research and technology while we dismissed them as insignificant. The humans somehow became the catalyst that united them into effective resistance. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. The Galactic Empire's control had always rested on the assumption that client species would never effectively cooperate against their masters. Individual worlds might rebel, but they could be easily crushed. Coordinated resistance involving multiple species had been considered impossible. What are our current intelligence reports from other sectors? Zethkar demanded. Grand Intelligence Director Korfth activated the chamber's main display, showing a galactic map that made every Dominar present feel sick. Red zones indicated active rebellion, yellow showed suspected resistance activity, and green represented secure Imperial territory. The map was predominantly red and yellow. Supreme Commander, we're receiving reports of uprisings in over 200 systems. The victory at Earth has inspired resistance movements throughout the Empire. Many species that we believed were pacified are suddenly demonstrating military capabilities we didn't know they possessed. Zethkar studied the display with growing alarm. Mobilize the core fleet. We'll crush these rebellions one by one and remind the galaxy why the Empire has endured for 1,000 years. Supreme Commander, Admiral Vexnari interrupted carefully. Mobilizing the core fleet would leave the central worlds undefended. Intelligence suggests that the Resistance has been planning coordinated strikes on our most important facilities. As if summoned by his words, emergency alarms began blaring throughout the chamber. The massive doors burst open as Imperial Guard commanders rushed in with urgent reports. Supreme Commander, we're receiving distress signals from the orbital shipyards at Dominar Prime. They're under attack by unknown forces. Unknown forces? Zethkar's voice rose to a roar. Our homeworld is the most heavily defended system in the galaxy. Yes, Supreme Commander, but the attackers aren't using conventional approach vectors. They're coming from hyperspace coordinates that should be impossible to navigate. The main display shifted to show real-time footage from Dominar Prime's orbital defenses. What they saw defied everything the Empire thought it knew about space warfare. Ships were appearing inside the system's defensive perimeter, materializing from hyperspace jumps that should have been suicidal. The attacking vessels were immediately recognizable as human designs, but they were operating in ways that violated basic principles of faster-than-light travel. How are they doing that? Senator Krextall demanded. Grand Admiral Vexnari consulted his tactical experts via secure communication. Our scientists believe the humans have developed some form of precision hyperspace navigation. They're making micro-jumps with accuracy that we didn't think was physically possible. On the display, the human ships were systematically destroying the orbital shipyards that had been the pride of Imperial engineering. Each facility represented decades of construction and irreplaceable manufacturing capability. Sir, another guard commander reported, we're also receiving distress calls from the research stations at Kethmore, the mining operations at Ursker 7, and the communication nexus at Zephyr Central. Zethkar realized with growing horror that the resistance wasn't just responding to Imperial aggression. They were executing a coordinated campaign designed to cripple the Empire's ability to wage war. Supreme Commander, Intelligence Director Corfith announced, his voice barely concealing panic. We're now confirming simultaneous attacks on 17 critical Imperial facilities across 8 sectors. This isn't random rebellion. This is strategic warfare conducted by an enemy that understands our infrastructure better than we do. The chamber erupted in angry hissing and claw-clicking as the Dominar senators realized the true scope of what they were facing. For the first time in Imperial history, their enemies weren't simply trying to break free. They were actively working to destroy the Empire itself. How many ships do we have available for immediate deployment? Zethkar demanded. Approximately 3,000 vessels in various states of readiness, Admiral Vexnari replied. But Supreme Commander, our intelligence indicates that the combined resistance fleets now number over 5,000 ships, with more joining them daily. The Supreme Commander's claws scraped deep grooves in the obsidian podium. Then we use the ultimate sanction. Prepare the planet killers. A horrified silence fell over the chamber. The planet killers were the Empire's most feared weapons. Massive ships capable of destroying entire worlds. They had only been used 12 times in Imperial history, each deployment serving as a terrifying reminder of the price of rebellion. Supreme Commander, Senator Krextall spoke carefully. The planet killers require significant resources to deploy. If we use them against rebelling worlds, we lose those systems' economic output permanently. Better to rule over ashes than to not rule at all, Zethkar snarled. Contact Admiral Thexran. Have him prepare the World Ender for immediate deployment to the Sol system. We'll make an example of Earth that will end this rebellion permanently. But even as the orders went out, reports continued flooding in from across the Empire. The Helix Nebula colonies had declared independence and were actively hunting Imperial tax collectors. The Outer Rim mining worlds had ceased all shipments of strategic materials. Most terrifying of all, the slave worlds that provided the Empire's manual labor were experiencing coordinated uprisings. Supreme Commander, a communications officer announced, we're receiving a transmission from the human Admiral Morrison. He's broadcasting on all Imperial frequencies. Put it through, Zethkar commanded. I want to hear what these insects have to say before we exterminate them. Admiral Morrison's image appeared on the main display, but he wasn't alone. Standing beside him were representatives of dozens of species that had joined the resistance. Captain Talara of the Helix Liberation Front, Commander Vorthak of the Free Erskine Republic, and faces that represented worlds the Empire had considered permanently pacified. High Dominar Zethkar, Morrison began, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who held the stronger position. By now you've realized that this isn't a simple rebellion. This is a revolution that has been planned for decades. Every species you've oppressed, every world you've exploited, every being you've treated as property has been working toward this moment. The human admiral gestured to his companions. We know about the planet killers. We know you're preparing to destroy Earth as an example to others. What you don't know is that we've been preparing for that possibility. Morrison smiled grimly. You see, Supreme Commander, you made one critical error. You taught us how your technology works. For 30 years, humans and other client species have been maintaining your ships, operating your stations and building your weapons. We know every weakness, every vulnerability, every critical system that keeps your empire functioning. The display shifted to show real-time images from across Imperial space. On world after world, critical infrastructure was failing. Power plants shut down mysteriously. Communication networks went dark. Automated defense systems turned against their Imperial masters. Every human engineer who ever worked on an Imperial facility, Morrison continued, every alien technician who was forced to maintain your war machines, every enslaved scientist who designed your weapons, they all left gifts for you. Hidden programs, subtle modifications, carefully placed vulnerabilities that could be activated when the time was right. Zethkar watched in growing horror as the Empire's technological superiority crumbled before his eyes. Across the galaxy, Imperial ships were suffering catastrophic system failures. Defense platforms were targeting their own fleets. The Imperial fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system, with all the arrogance that had served them well for 1,000 years. High Admiral Korath, the Empire's most decorated military commander, stood on the bridge of the massive dreadnought Imperial Supremacy and surveyed what he expected to be a brief and decisive engagement. Scan the human defensive positions, he ordered his tactical officer. I want this rebellion crushed quickly and completely. The other client species need to see what happens to those who defy the Empire. The tactical display showed Earth's defensive fleet arranged in what appeared to be a traditional formation around their homeworld. 300 human ships against 800 Imperial vessels. The outcome seemed predetermined. High Admiral, the communications officer announced, the humans are transmitting on all frequencies. Korath gestured dismissively, no doubt begging for mercy. Ignore them. Begin the attack. But Admiral Morrison's voice carried across the Imperial fleet anyway, broadcast on emergency channels that couldn't be blocked. Imperial forces, this is your final warning. Turn back now, or face the consequences of your aggression against a sovereign world. Laughter echoed across the Imperial bridge. The idea that humans could threaten the mighty Empire was so absurd that even the normally disciplined crew couldn't maintain their composure. Launch fighters, Korath commanded. I want their pathetic fleet destroyed within the hour. 2,000 Imperial fighters screamed toward the human defensive line, their pilots confident in their technological superiority. The Empire's fighter craft were faster, more maneuverable, and equipped with shields that could deflect most primitive weapons. What they encountered was nothing like what they expected. The human fighters that rose to meet them moved with unprecedented coordination, as if guided by a single mind. Their weapons fired in perfect synchronization, creating overlapping fields of destruction that the Imperial pilots couldn't navigate. More importantly, the human ships seemed to know exactly where the Imperial fighters would be before they got there. What's happening out there? Korath demanded as his tactical display showed Imperial fighters being systematically destroyed. Unknown, High Admiral. Their targeting systems appear to be far more advanced than our intelligence indicated. They're achieving hit rates that should be mathematically impossible. What the Empire didn't know was that humanity had solved the problem of coordinated fleet combat in a way that no other species had attempted. Instead of relying on traditional command structures, they had developed a quantum-linked battle network that allowed every human ship to share targeting data. Instantaneously, the result was a fleet that fought as a single organism rather than individual. Units, sir. The tactical officer's voice carried a note of concern. We've lost 60% of our fighter screen. The humans are advancing on our main fleet. Korath studied the display with growing unease. This wasn't how the battle was supposed to proceed. Order the dreadnoughts forward. We'll crush them with superior firepower. The massive Imperial capital ships moved toward Earth, their weapons charging for a bombardment that would reduce the human homeworld to a cinder. But as they advanced, something unprecedented happened. Ships began appearing throughout the system. Not just the resistance fleets that Imperial intelligence had dismissed as insignificant, but vessels from species that the Empire hadn't even known were capable of rebellion. The Crystalline Collective, whose homeworld had been strip-mined for rare elements, emerged from hyperspace with ships grown rather than built, their organic hulls pulsing with bioluminescent weapon systems. The Void Walkers, a nomadic species forced to wander between stars after their homeworld was destroyed for Imperial expansion, brought ships designed to fight in the cold depths of space where conventional vessels couldn't operate. Most shocking of all, the Catamaran Unity appeared with a fleet of ships that incorporated Imperial technology, but pushed it far beyond what the Empire thought possible. The Catamaran had been slaves for 3 centuries, forced to work in Imperial research facilities. They had learned their captors' secrets well. "High Admiral," the communications officer reported, his voice shaking. "We're detecting over 3,000 hostile vessels. They're surrounding us." Korath felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't experienced in decades. Doubt. Impossible. Our intelligence networks would have detected a buildup of this magnitude. But Admiral Morrison's voice cut through the Imperial channel once again. "High Admiral Korath, you're surrounded. Your fleet is outnumbered 4-1, and you're trapped in our home system where we have every advantage. I'm offering you one chance to withdraw with honor." The Imperial bridge erupted in angry hissing. The suggestion that they would retreat from primitive species was an insult beyond tolerance. "Never," Korath snarled. "All ships engage the enemy. Show these upstart species the price of defying the Empire." The battle that followed would be remembered as the day the Empire learned that fear was a two-edged weapon. For 1,000 years they had used terror to maintain control, never considering that eventually their victims might become more afraid of continued subjugation than of death in battle. The human fleet struck first, their quantum-linked targeting systems allowing them to focus the firepower of dozens of ships on single Imperial vessels. Massive dreadnoughts that had terrorized entire sectors found themselves overwhelmed by coordinated attacks that their shields couldn't deflect. The resistance fleets attacked with the fury of beings who had suffered under Imperial rule for generations. They didn't fight like traditional military forces. They fought like revolutionaries who knew that victory meant freedom, while defeat meant extinction. The crystalline collective's bioships proved nearly impossible to damage with conventional weapons. Their organic hulls regenerated faster than Imperial guns could destroy them. The Voidwalkers used hit-and-run tactics, appearing from the dark spaces between planets to strike at Imperial supply ships before vanishing again. The Catamaran Unity demonstrated technologies that made Imperial scientists weep with frustration. Weapons that ignored shields entirely. Defensive systems that absorbed energy attacks and redirected them at attackers. Ships that could phase in and out of normal space. "Sir, we've lost 40% of our fleet," the tactical officer reported. "The enemy is using coordinated attacks that our defensive protocols can't counter." Korath watched his mighty armada being systematically dismantled by species he had considered barely worthy of notice. "How is this possible? These are primitive civilizations." Admiral Morrison's voice carried a note of grim satisfaction. "High Admiral, you made the same mistake that bullies always make. You assumed that being strong meant you were smart. You controlled the galaxy through fear, but you never bothered to understand the beings you were terrorizing." The human admiral's image appeared on the Imperial flagship's main screen, broadcasting from the bridge of the Defiance. "Every species you subjugated spent generations learning your weaknesses while you grew complacent in your power. Every world you conquered produced engineers and scientists who dreamed of the day they could turn your own technology against you. You created this resistance through your own cruelty." Korath realized with growing horror that the Empire was facing something it had never encountered before. An enemy that had been planning for this moment for centuries. These weren't desperate rebels striking out in futile rage. This was a coordinated revolution that had been carefully prepared and perfectly executed. "High Admiral," his communications officer called urgently, "we're receiving surrender offers from 17 of our ships. Their captains are requesting permission to withdraw." For the first time in Imperial history, an invasion fleet was asking permission to retreat. 6 months after the council session, the Terran Independence Fleet emerged from the shadow of Luna's dark side like vengeful ghosts. Admiral Morrison stood on the bridge of the flagship Defiance, watching as 300 human warships took their positions around Earth. These weren't the sleek, elegant vessels favored by the Empire. They were angular, brutal-looking machines designed for one purpose: making the enemy pay dearly for every victory. "Admiral, all ships report ready," Commander Hassan announced from the communication station. "The orbital defense platforms are online and our ground-based shield generators are at full power." Morrison nodded, studying the tactical display. Earth now bristled with defensive systems that had been secretly constructed over the past months. Hidden shipyards in the asteroid belt had worked around the clock, while the best human engineers had taken Imperial technology and improved it in ways that no other species had thought possible. "Any word from the diplomatic front?" Morrison asked. "President Vasquez transmitted our Declaration of Independence to the Imperial Senate 3 hours ago," Hassan replied. The response was predictable. The communication board lit up as an incoming transmission arrived on the emergency Imperial frequency. Morrison gestured for it to be displayed on the main screen. The image that appeared showed High Dominar Zethkar, the Empire's supreme military commander. His reptilian features were twisted with what humans had learned to recognize as barely controlled rage. Behind him, the opulent chamber of the Imperial War Council gleamed with precious metals and trophies from conquered worlds. "Primitive human insects," the High Dominar hissed, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You dare to defy the eternal order of the Galactic Empire? Your pathetic world will be reduced to molten slag within the week. Your species will serve as an example to any other worlds foolish enough to consider rebellion." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the bridge in silence. Morrison turned to his staff, noting their grim expressions. "Well, that was about as diplomatic as expected," he said dryly. "Commander Hassan, please transmit our response on all Imperial frequencies. I want every species in the galaxy to hear this." Hassan activated the communications array, and Morrison stepped forward to address not just the Empire, but the countless civilizations that had bent the knee to Dominar rule. "High Dominar Zethkar, I am Admiral Morrison of the Terran Defense Force. You are correct that we are defying the Empire. You are also correct that you possess the firepower to destroy our world. What you have failed to consider is the cost of that destruction." Morrison gestured to the tactical display behind him, showing the positions of human forces throughout the galaxy. "For 30 years, humans have served throughout the Empire as technicians, engineers, traders, and laborers. We have built your ships, maintained your stations, and operated your most critical infrastructure. As of today, every human in Imperial space has received new orders." The display shifted to show Imperial facilities across dozens of worlds, each marked with human population centers. If Earth is attacked, if even one human civilian is harmed in retaliation for our Declaration of Independence, every human in the galaxy becomes a saboteur. Your ships will suffer mysterious malfunctions. Your power plants will experience catastrophic failures. Your trade routes will become death traps. Morrison's voice hardened. "You see, High Dominar, you made a critical error. You allowed us to become integral to your civilization's functioning, because you believed we lacked the courage to use that access against you. Today you discover how wrong you were." The Admiral paused, letting his words sink in. "But we are not monsters. We offer you an alternative. Recognize Earth's independence, grant humans equal status in the Empire, and nothing changes. We continue to work, trade, and coexist peacefully. The choice is yours." As the transmission ended, Morrison turned to his tactical officer. "What's our intelligence on Imperial fleet movements?" Lieutenant Commander Park consulted her displays. 3 Imperial battle groups are converging on our system. Total strength, approximately 800 ships. They'll arrive in 72 hours. The bridge crew exchanged glances. Even with their improvements, the human fleet was outnumbered nearly 3-1. In a conventional battle, they would be annihilated. "Good thing we're not planning a conventional battle," Morrison said with a slight smile. "Commander Hassan, please contact our friends in the Resistance." For years, the Empire had dismissed reports of organized resistance movements among the client species. They preferred to believe that such groups were either non-existent or too insignificant to matter. This was another critical error in judgment. The main screen flickered to life, showing a dozen different faces from across the galaxy. Captain Tilara of the Helix Liberation Front, Commander Vorthak of the Free Erskine Republic, Dr. Ceylon of the Zephyr Independence Movement, representatives of species that had spent decades planning for the day when someone would be brave enough to strike the first blow against imperial tyranny. "Human Admiral," Tilara spoke first, her 6 arms moving in what her species considered a gesture of respect. "We have monitored your declaration. Our fleet stand ready to support your cause." Morrison felt a surge of pride. The careful diplomatic work that Ambassador Chen and others had conducted over the years was finally bearing fruit. "Thank you, Captain Tilara. What's your combined strength?" Vorthak's bear-like face showed what might have been a grin. Approximately 2,000 ships, Admiral. Not as advanced as Imperial vessels, but commanded by beings who have been waiting their entire lives for this moment. The tactical display updated to show the true scope of the rebellion. Across the galaxy, hidden fleets were emerging from asteroid bases, abandoned systems, and the dark spaces between stars. What the Empire had dismissed as isolated terrorist cells had actually been a coordinated resistance network spanning hundreds of worlds. The Empire believes in the power of fear, Dr. Celan observed, her crystalline features catching the light. They assume that demonstrating overwhelming force will crush any opposition. They have never faced coordinated resistance on this scale. Morrison nodded. Our immediate goal is to survive their initial attack and prove that the Empire can be challenged. If we can do that, more species will join us. If we fail, then we die free, Captain Talara finished, which is better than living as slaves. As the various resistance leaders signed off to prepare their forces, Morrison turned his attention to the approaching Imperial fleet. On paper, it was an overwhelming force. In reality, it represented the Empire's greatest weakness, their complete reliance on fear and intimidation. Admiral, Commander Hassan reported, "We're receiving a priority transmission from Earth. It's Marcus Chen." Morrison raised an eyebrow. "The boy? Put him through." Marcus appeared on a smaller display, now 13, and showing the confidence that came from having survived his encounter with Imperial cruelty. "Admiral Morrison, I wanted you to know that every kid on Earth is watching what happens next. We know you're going to win." "I appreciate the confidence, Marcus, but the odds are pretty steep." The teenager smiled. "My mom says that humans are really good at beating long odds. Something about being too stubborn to know when we're beaten." Morrison chuckled. "Your mother is a wise woman. Don't worry, son. We're going to show the Empire what happens when they pick on someone smaller than them." As the transmission ended, Morrison looked out at the stars where the Imperial fleet was approaching. In 72 hours, the galaxy would learn whether humanity's defiance was brave or merely suicidal. Either way, the age of unquestioned Imperial dominance was about to end. The emergency session of the United Earth Council convened within 6 hours of Ambassador Chen's return. The great assembly hall in Geneva buzzed with tension as representatives from every nation gathered to hear what had transpired at Nexus Prime. President Vasquez stood at the central podium, her face grim as she reviewed the security footage that had been transmitted from the trading station. The holographic display showed the incident in crystal clear detail. Every council member watched in silence as the Dominar official casually struck 12-year-old Marcus Chen, then walked away as if nothing had happened. The boy's shocked face, the thin line of blood, and his mother's carefully controlled reaction painted a picture that needed no explanation. "Ladies and gentlemen," President Vasquez began, her voice carrying across the silent chamber, "we have reached a crossroads. For 30 years, humanity has accepted its position in the Galactic Empire. We have followed their laws, paid their taxes, and endured their condescension because we believed that patience would eventually earn us respect." She gestured to the frozen image on the display. "This is what our patience has earned us. The right to watch our children be struck down for the crime of existing in the same space as our so-called superiors." General Martinez, the head of Earth's Unified Defense Force, leaned forward in his seat. The grizzled veteran had been arguing for a more aggressive stance toward the Empire for years. "Madam President, our military capabilities have grown significantly since we joined the Empire. We're no longer the primitive world they first encountered." Ambassador Chen sat in the front row, Marcus beside her with a small bandage on his cheek. She had insisted on bringing him to the session, believing that the council needed to see the face of what they were discussing. "The Empire sees us as useful slaves," she said when called upon to speak. "Nothing more. They tolerate our presence because we provide cheap labor and raw materials. But respect? True membership in their galactic community? They would rather die than grant us such dignity." Chancellor Nakamura from the Pacific Federation raised her hand. "Ambassador, what was the official response from the Dominar hierarchy when you filed a formal complaint?" Sarah's expression darkened. "They refused to acknowledge that any wrongdoing had occurred. According to their legal framework, the official in question was well within his rights to discipline what they termed an unruly primitive. The fact that Marcus is a child was deemed irrelevant. A murmur of outrage rippled through the assembly. Even the most diplomatic representatives were beginning to understand the reality of humanity's situation. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, Earth's leading xenobiologist, activated her data tablet. I've been analyzing the Empire's social structure for decades. What happened to Marcus wasn't an aberration or the action of one cruel individual. It's the natural result of a system that views us as inherently inferior. In their minds, we exist at their sufferance. President Vasquez nodded grimly. Which brings us to the question we must answer today. Do we continue to accept this treatment, hoping that someday they might deign to treat us as equals? Or do we chart a different course? Admiral Morrison stood up from his position with the military delegation. Madam President, I've been reviewing our defensive capabilities. When we first encountered the Empire, their technology was so far beyond ours that resistance would have been suicide. That gap has narrowed considerably. The Admiral activated a holographic display showing comparative technology charts. Our shipyards have been producing vessels using modified Imperial designs for 20 years. Our engineers have made significant improvements to their basic templates. More importantly, we've developed technologies that the Empire has overlooked because they dismiss our innovative capabilities. Representative Sarah Williams from the African Union leaned forward. Admiral, are you suggesting we could actually challenge the Empire militarily? I'm suggesting that we're no longer helpless, Morrison replied carefully. Whether we choose to use that strength is a political decision, not a military one. President Vasquez called for order as voices began to rise throughout the chamber. Before we discuss any specific actions, we need to understand exactly what we're facing. Dr. Chen, would you please brief the Council on your analysis of Imperial strategic weaknesses? Dr. Elizabeth Chen, Sarah's sister and Earth's premier expert on galactic politics, stepped up to the secondary podium. She had spent years studying the Empire's structure, and her insights had proven invaluable in navigating the complex web of galactic relationships. The Galactic Empire is vast, but that vastness is also its greatest weakness, she began. They control over 10,000 worlds, but their military forces are spread thin. They rely on the assumption that their client species will never rebel because the cost would be too high. She gestured to a galactic map showing Imperial territory. Most worlds in the Empire are essentially self-governing, as long as they pay their taxes and follow basic Imperial law. The Dominar directly control only about 50 core worlds. Everything else is maintained through a combination of economic dependency and the fear of retaliation. Chancellor Okafor from the African Federation asked, "What kind of retaliation are we talking about?" "Orbital bombardment," Dr. Chen replied bluntly. "Complete sterilization of rebellious worlds. It's happened 12 times in Imperial history, and each incident is well documented and widely publicized. The message is clear: obey or die." The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't a matter of political maneuvering or economic sanctions. If Earth chose to defy the Empire, they were potentially signing the death warrant for every human being in the galaxy. Marcus Chen suddenly stood up, his young voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere. "May I say something?" President Vasquez looked surprised but nodded. "Of course, Marcus." The 12-year-old walked to the center of the chamber, still wearing his small bandage. "I know I'm just a kid, but this is about me too, right? About what kind of galaxy I'm going to grow up in." He looked around at the assembled representatives, his voice steady despite his youth. "That alien hit me because he could, because he knew nobody would stop him. And you know what the worst part was? All those other aliens in the corridor just looked away. They didn't care because they were just glad it wasn't them." Marcus turned to face President Vasquez directly. "My mom taught me that bullies only stop when someone stands up to them. The Empire thinks we're too scared to fight back. Maybe they're right, but maybe they're not." The boy returned to his seat, leaving the chamber in stunned silence. Finally, President Vasquez spoke again. "I think Marcus has summarized our situation quite clearly. The Empire has shown us exactly what they think of humanity. The question now is, what are we going to do about it?" General Martinez was the first to respond. "Madam President, I recommend we begin immediate preparation for what the military calls defensive independence. We can't launch an aggressive war against the Empire, but we can make ourselves too costly to suppress." "And how do we do that?" asked Chancellor Nakamura. Admiral Morrison smiled grimly. "We remind the galaxy that humans are very, very good at one particular thing: something that most species have forgotten how to do effectively, which is, we know how to fight wars that we're supposed to lose. The trading station Nexus Prime hummed with activity as beings from across the galaxy conducted their daily business. Ambassador Sarah Chen walked through the crowded corridors, her diplomatic badge gleaming under the artificial lights. She had been stationed here for 3 years, working to strengthen humanity's position in the Galactic Empire. Earth was still considered a minor world, barely worth the Empire's attention, but Sarah believed that would change with time and patience. Her 12-year-old son Marcus walked beside her, wide-eyed at the incredible diversity of alien species surrounding them. This was his first visit to the station, and everything fascinated him. Tall, crystalline beings from Zephyr Prime clinked softly as they moved. 6-armed traders from the Helix Nebula juggled multiple data tablets. Floating gas bag creatures from the outer rim drifted past, their tentacles gently steering them through the crowds. "Mom, look at that one," Marcus whispered, pointing at a massive, bear-like creature covered in purple fur. "It has 4 eyes!" Sarah smiled, remembering her own first encounter with the Erskine species. They're actually very gentle despite their size. Their homeworld has twin suns, so they evolved extra eyes to handle the complex lighting. As they approached the diplomatic quarter, Sarah noticed the usual tension in the air. The Galactic Empire maintained order through a strict hierarchy. The ruling Dominar species sat at the top, followed by their various client races. Humans occupied one of the lowest positions, barely above the recently conquered worlds that had no voice at all. The corridor ahead was particularly crowded, with a group of Dominar officials making their way through. These reptilian beings stood nearly 8 feet tall, their scaled skin gleaming with an oily sheen. Their elongated heads housed cold, calculating eyes that seemed to look down on everything around them. Lesser species quickly moved aside, pressing themselves against the walls in deference. Sarah gently guided Marcus to the side, following standard protocol. She had learned early in her diplomatic career that challenging Dominar authority, even accidentally, could have serious consequences for Earth standing in the Empire. But Marcus, being 12 and curious, didn't immediately understand the social dynamics at play. As the Dominar group passed, he stepped forward slightly, trying to get a better look at their ornate ceremonial armor. The lead Dominar, a particularly large specimen with scarred hide and cruel eyes, noticed the movement. His head snapped toward Marcus with predatory focus. "Inferior species," he hissed in the common trade language, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to absolute obedience. "You will show proper respect." Before Sarah could react, the Dominar's massive clawed hand shot out and struck Marcus across the face. The blow sent the boy stumbling backward, a thin line of blood appearing where the alien's claw had scraped his cheek. The entire corridor fell silent. Every being present stopped what they were doing, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere. Sarah felt her world narrow to a single point of white-hot fury as she watched her son hit the floor. "You struck my child," she said, her voice deadly quiet. The diplomatic training that had served her so well over the years warred with primal maternal instinct. The Dominar looked down at her with obvious disdain. The whelp needed to learn respect. Consider it a lesson in proper imperial hierarchy. His companions made sounds that might have been laughter. Sarah knelt beside Marcus, helping him to his feet. The boy was more shocked than hurt, but the message was clear. In the Galactic Empire, humans were so far beneath the Dominar that striking a human child was considered appropriate discipline. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" she asked softly, examining the scratch on his face. Marcus nodded, but she could see the confusion and hurt in his eyes. This wasn't the grand adventure he had imagined. This was a harsh lesson in the reality of humanity's place in the galaxy. The Dominar official was already moving away, dismissing the incident as unworthy of further attention. To him, this was no different than swatting an annoying insect. As Sarah stood up, something fundamental shifted inside her. She had spent 3 years playing by the Empire's rules, accepting humanity's low status, believing that patience and diplomacy would eventually earn them respect. But watching her child bleed because some alien considered him beneath notice changed everything. The other beings in the corridor began to move again, eager to distance themselves from the incident. No one offered help or sympathy. In the Empire, power was the only currency that mattered, and humans had none. Sarah activated her personal communicator with steady hands, her diplomatic mask firmly in place. This is Ambassador Chen requesting immediate secure communication with Earth Central Command. The response came quickly. Ambassador, this is Admiral Morrison. What's your status? Admiral, I need to speak with the President immediately. We have a situation that requires the highest level of response. There was a pause. Admiral Morrison had worked with Sarah long enough to recognize when she was operating in full diplomatic mode. Her tone suggested something significant had occurred. Stand by, Ambassador. Patching you through on maximum encryption. As they waited for the connection, Sarah looked down at Marcus. The scratch on his face was already beginning to heal, but she knew the memory would stay with him forever. More importantly, she knew this moment would stay with her. President Elena Vasquez came on the line within minutes. Sarah, what's happened? Madam President, a Dominar official just physically assaulted Marcus, struck him across the face for the crime of being curious. No provocation, no threat. They did it because they could. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. When the president spoke again, her voice was ice cold. Are you certain about the details, Ambassador? Completely certain, ma'am. Multiple witnesses. Security footage will confirm everything. Another pause. Ambassador, you are hereby recalled to Earth immediately. Bring your son home. We need to discuss humanity's future relationship with the Galactic Empire. As Sarah ended the communication, she realized that something irreversible had just begun. The Empire had made a critical error in judgment. They had assumed that humans would accept any treatment, no matter how degrading, because they lacked the power to respond. They were about to learn how wrong they were.